What's the evolutionary explanation for sibling rivalry?
Well, there's a bunch of different things really that go into the evolutionary explanation for why that is a recurrent theme in a lot of fiction and a lot of history. And so there's really two aspects to it, right? So when you think about why siblings would compete, one reason is parental attention, parental resources, right? So from an evolutionary perspective, parents spend a lot of time and effort in giving resources to their children, right? Have their fitness vehicles. Um, but not every child is an equal fitness vehicle. Some children will give you a better return in a sense on your investment. If you have an only child, they're your only option, right? So you'd expect a huge amount of investment. If you have multiple children in the same family, you have a problem from the parental sort of perspective. How do you allocate your resources? Do you allocate them equally? Do you vary it depending on what the children need and how they're going to best recognize that or realize that investment? And so there's that parental aspect and competition for parental resources. But there's also the fact that you have different siblings in the family at the same time competing for resources, right? And competing for other things, right? They may be even competing in the same social groups, depending on what the age spread is, depending on whether it's the same sex or opposite sex. So there's a sibling competition aspect to why you see conflict and why you see different levels of conflict between children. And then there's the parental investment aspect of it as well. And there's a lot of research on how parents may favor certain children or may have more expectations of certain children that may cause resources to be allocated in different ways. And then the children have to compete or do things to make themselves different and get the resources that they need and the attention that they need in the family. So those are the two big factors that sort of from an adaptationist perspective would shape differences in terms of sibling conflict.
Hmm. And is there an optimal age gap and amount of offspring to have based on human evolution?
I'm not sure about the optimal amount. I think that's probably going to, in terms of number of children, that's going to depend on parental resources to a certain extent. But the age gap, I think if you want lower amounts of conflict between children, larger age gaps tend to result in that. So when children are really close in age, with the one exception being twins, when children are close in age, they tend to have more competition because they're competing for the same things, right? They need the same things from their parents, right? It's like you've got one child still breastfeeding and another kid comes along. They really are competing for the same thing, right? On the other hand, if children are like greater than 3 years, for example, right? If you think about the natural sort of weaning age cycle, if kids are like 3, 4, 5 years apart, then they're not competing for the same things. And also, if they're opposite sex, they may be competing for different things as well, and they may have different social groups. So those things will tend to reduce levels of conflict in that sense. The optimal number is a trickier question, right? And I mean, that's a big question today, right? We've been talking about the fertility crisis and we need to have people have more babies. Um, from any particular focal individual's perspective, right? The optimal number of offspring has to do with the actual success of those offspring. So you want the number of offspring that can survive and reproduce in turn, right? So another way of thinking about it is uh, thinking about it in terms of likelihood of getting grandchildren out of the situation, right? And so if you're strapped for resources, for you, an optimal number is actually going to be a smaller number of offspring. Um, and if you have lots and lots of resources, if you're the Elon Musk of the world, right, an optimal number of children will be a greater number of children because you can actually provide all the resources that they need to realize their own success in a way that you can't if you don't have the time and resources to invest in as many children. So the optimal number will be different depending on your own circumstances, right? The environment that you're in.
Hmm. And speaking of the fertility crisis, how likely is it that Western countries, do you think, will be able to get above replacement rate? Will it kind of hit us like a truck and everyone will start panicking and have loads of kids, or is it going to be a slow increase or no increase at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really hard to predict at this current time. You're seeing a lot of people getting really concerned about it, or at least, projecting out a lot of concerns about what the next 20 or 30 years are going to be like. I mean, I think there's a couple different things that we end up tossing around when we think about that. One is are you only interested in replacement within a population from the reproduction of the people already in that population? Are you going to take into account immigration from countries where they actually have a higher fertility rate? The only reason that a lot of countries are sort of at replacement rate now is because of immigration already. Um, the idea that you're going to be able to ratchet up the actual reproduction of individuals within that population in a short period of time is very unlikely to me. I mean, I think if we think about what are the incentives and what are the barriers for people having larger families, I mean, there has been a huge change. So in when I was growing up, there were lots of families where there were maybe two, because people wanted a boy and a girl. But there were two or three or four kids in a family, but not a lot that were much bigger than that. Maybe some rural families, but it wasn't a huge urban thing. But in my parents' generation, my dad was one of four boys. My mother was one of eight, right? She's the
Wow.
oldest of eight, four boys, four girls. That wasn't common back then. And they lived in a city. They weren't my dad was rural population, but my mom was not. And so if we think about what are the incentives and what are the barriers, right? There's a lot of things that make it difficult to have large families, even if you want them, from financial to delaying reproduction, right? Because you want to have a really good job, or just for women, you want an education and a job, right? And then now you're pushing into zones where infertility can be,
Mm.
right? That's another factor that people have talked about in terms of that. So there are these things that can be barriers to it, even if people want to have more children. And then there are lots of people who probably don't necessarily want to have any children or don't want to have a lot of children, right? And, from an ancestral standpoint, it didn't matter whether you wanted to have children or not. Pre-birth control, if you were having sex, you had kids sooner or later,
Mm.
right? Now we have the ability to control reproduction. And so it actually does matter whether you want to have kids or not as to whether you have them. And so, maybe we need to do a little bit more to understand why some people just are not interested in children. Not because I think we're necessarily going to be able to change that for those people, but it might allow us to understand, okay, we're going to have a threshold of people who are not going to be interested in reproducing, and nothing you do is going to change. Maybe if you want to improve fertility rate, you need to concentrate on something else.
Mm. And is that number of people who don't want to have children increasing versus
I
previous
don't think it's
generations?
the number so much who don't want to have children who are increasing. I think the number of people who think that the cost of having children, whether it's financial or otherwise, is too high, is probably the group that's increasing. And I say that because it's not just the financial cost of having children, it's the time, it's the hobbies that you might think are really important when you're younger fall on the wayside of having to deal with childcare and then dealing with other things. So one of my really good friends, she has children. And one of the challenges for her of having children is, you've got work and you've got children. And then do you have other time for other things, right? Hobbies or other interests, or even your own research, right? That you might be doing. Like there's a lot of things that people value that they may not be able to do if they have children or a lot of children. And I think that group of people, especially for women, that probably has increased because women's role in society has changed, right? Women are working as much as men in many places and in many countries. And they may value their career and their status and their achievement in their career as much as men do. And that may cause them to not want to sacrifice that as much to take care of kids, which is, it's a trade off, right? How much energy you're going to give to this or this. And I think that there's maybe an increasing number of people in societies that have greater gender equality who are making that choice.
Yeah. And how real versus fictional is that idea that once men and women get to the age of maybe 30, 35 or late 30s, they have this flood of hormones that makes them want to have kids. Is that an actual thing? Because I've heard a few instances of that.
I don't think it's so much the flood of hormones that do it. It's the recognition that you've got a limited window, especially for women. I mean, for guys, it's a little bit different. I mean, I think that for some guys, if they're not married at a certain point, they all of a sudden start thinking, oh, crap, I need to do this if I'm going to do it. But I think that if you look at, it's not so much that like for men that it's a big hormonal shift. I mean,
Yeah.
testosterone decreases as men get older, but I don't think there's some huge shift that influences it. And of course, men can sometimes reproduce at substantially older ages. And we see that often in celebrities and stuff like that. You're like, oh my God, that guy's 70 and he just had a kid. But for women, we know that fertility decreases and it trails off slowly. And then, of course, menopause is a very abrupt end to things. But that slow decline is happening in women. For most women, it's starting in their 30s, in a way that can be apparent when they try having kids.
Yeah.
And that's often a time when women are being most successful in their careers, right? So there is a real challenge for them. I mean, people have talked about harvesting eggs and freezing them, and that reproductive technology may be a way around that problem. And I think it might be for women who have resources to do that,
Yeah.
right? Or good insurance to do that, or whatever it is. It's not going to be an option for everyone, but it would be an option for some women that way. But I don't think it's that women's hormones are certainly doing it. I think it's sort of like a realization that you're reaching an age at which if I don't have them now, even if I can have them, I'm going to have a toddler and I'm going to be 50. And I'm not going to have the energy to chase my toddler and do my work and everything else. As people, I mean, again, and this is a totally different kind of topic, but as people get older, right? I mean, there's a lot of research now focused on longevity and how we can age more healthy than we maybe have in the past, or in the recent past. And I think, unless we fix that problem, having kids at older ages is much more stressful.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely would be very stressful. If you're like 60.
It's easier to stay up overnight when you're 25 and you're taking care of a kid than when you're 50. But
Yeah.
you're lucky enough that you get pregnant at like 48 or something like that. Yeah, it's still going to be tough to do that work at that age.
And what's the possible evolutionary explanations for that cutoff point around 35, 40, where the women's fertility dramatically drops?
Yeah, I mean, from approximate level, it's just hormones, right? It's just decreasing amounts of hormones. There's a lot of research on senescence from an evolutionary perspective, and like Randy Nessie's work, for example. And I believe Zita Cosmides is going to have a new paper out sometime in the near future, looking at this from a female perspective, specifically with regards to menopause, which I think will be really interesting. But I mean, part of it, I think there's a number of different things. So if you look at, and there's a number of different hypotheses, what I would say is that we don't have a hard and fast answer to that question. But if we look at non-human animals, right, many of them reproduce right up until the end, right? Or very close to the end, right? So that, in a species that lives like, whether it be chimpanzees or killer whales or something, they often will have offspring quite late in life. Maybe not the last year of life, but they get pretty close. And humans don't do that. And there's probably a number of reasons for that. One of them is that offspring don't do well without the parents in the human species, right? We have very sort of premature children in that sense. They don't pop out able to grab on to mom's back like chimpanzee baby. And, you can run around and they can handle things. Ours don't. They can't really walk. They can't do much other than feed and poop and cry and sleep. And it takes a while for them to be able to do much more than that. And so that's one thing. We can't be reproducing late in life or close to the end of our own lives because our offspring are not capable of surviving on their own. They need a lot of assistance from us. They need a lot of teaching from us. There's a lot of social learning that has to happen. And so we have this extended childhood and adolescence that we need to be able to compensate. And so that's part of it. The other part is that inevitably systems just degrade over time. And certainly there's some suggestion that the decline of estrogen contributes to the senescence of females in general. So it's not only causing, it is not only part of the menopausal process, but it also causes increased risk of other diseases, other problems. For Red disease, for example, it's very protective in younger women. But unfortunately, it's not so protective postmenopausally because the levels are so low. So, from an evolutionary perspective, you can look at, what are the sort of factors that contribute to the senescence of the system, right? And some of the things like high hormone levels in youth are associated with this greater senescence. The fact that we need to have our offspring young is also influenced by the fact that they need so much care. I think those go into play. And there has been also some discussion of what they call the grandmother hypothesis, which is the idea that at least for females, right, you need, there's a greater benefit to sort of living longer and provisioning your children and your grandchildren and providing a social resource for them than there would be in having offspring at that age, considering the likelihood that offspring born at that age will survive,
Yeah.
or that eggs are even viable at that stage, right? Because that's the other issue, is that the quality of eggs deteriorate over time. And we're not making new ones like guys do with sperm. It's like every day there's new sperm popping up. That's not how eggs work. And so there's a quality issue there. And so all of those things together, I think, contribute to, why, reproduction has to happen when it does, and why postponing it is a risky business in that.
Yeah, 100%. And how does evolution drive our desires and our maybe attraction and crushes towards people?
I mean, there's so many things that matter to that. I mean, a huge amount of the research, right, has focused on things like sex differences in mate preferences, right? And what are the adaptive problems that males and females face in the mating arena? And so I think it's worth pointing out that when we think about adaptations, there's a lot of adaptations or mechanisms that we don't think would have sex differences, right? Like finding food and finding shelter and stuff. All of the things that men and women would have faced the same problems. But people also pointed out that in the mating domain, some of those problems are different. Like, yes, both men and women need to find mates, but what makes a good mate, what increases mate value for males and females may be somewhat different because of the things that men and women are bringing to mateships, right? So if we want to think about some of the factors that might make good female mates, so from the male perspective, right? Thinking about mate preferences, youth and fertility, because of what we've just been talking about, are going to be relevant, right? If in the end, what matters is, are you passing on your genes and your preferences to the next generation? If men found postmenopausal women to be the sexiest thing on earth, that probably wouldn't lead to more people.
Yeah.
So youth and fertility, a lot of things that we think of as attractive in women are really indicators of youth and fertility. Quality of skin, quality of hair, shape of the body. Do you have a lot of energy? Do you got get up and go? All of these kinds of things, a lot of things that are estrogen markers in terms of facial features, right? These are all things that we think of as being attractive in women, and they're all things that are associated with fertility and youth. And so that's one aspect of things, but that's only one part. That's the offspring production part. But there's also what makes a good mom, right? I mean, is she empathetic? Is she kind? Is she good at caring about other individuals? Does she have lots of friends? Does she make good social ties, right? Does she have support? And in the modern world, we also may care about things like job opportunities and things like that. But ancestrally, that was probably not something that was really relevant. It was, one of the things that make her a good partner, right? And one of the things that make her a good mom, and one of the things that make her good at reproducing, right? These are going to be big factors. If you look at what would be important for women in choosing a partner, right? I mean, physical appearance is going to matter because it is also a health indicator, right? You want the guy to be around long enough. And some of the things that women care about in men's attractiveness, including things like muscularity or the shape of a male's body, indications that he's going to be a good protector, ancestrally, maybe that he was a good hunter or a good warrior, right? There's all of those kinds of traits that relate to physical prowess or a certain amount of aggressiveness in males. And that can also, the environment could influence how important those are, right? If you live in a more dangerous environment, those things are going to be even more important than they might be if you live in a really benign environment. And then is he going to be a good dad? Is he going to be a good provider, right? They always talk about how, what are examples of how you would know if a guy's a good dad? Does he have a dog? Does he love his dog? Do you always see him walking his dog? Is he cute with his dog? Yeah, I mean, they talk about studies where people show pictures of women, show women pictures of men with babies and things like that. But pets almost elicit the exact same reaction, right? Because can you care for something else and keep it alive, right? If you can't even keep a plant alive, that might be a bad your parenting skills, right? So that's going to be something that women might care about. And I mean, women are also going to care about things like commitment, right? In terms of his own attachment to her, because that matters for raising offspring. Is he going to be able to accrue resources, whether it's hunting or whatever way in the modern world, whether it's having a good job? Is he going to be able to do that to help provide for offspring? Because that's really important in terms of the survivorship of your children and how well they'll do in their own environment by how much you've invested in them in terms of time and effort. So things like commitment to her and commitment to children are going to be things that women are going to care about. So often when we talk about mate preferences, we focus on the physical aspects of it, but these other ones are really important when we're talking about long-term mateships, and maybe they matter less, like hooking up. And maybe the attractiveness matters more, but I think in the long run, a lot of these things are going to be important to those choices. And when we think about them in the ancestral environment, you can see very plainly, these are going to be, like really important to the survivorship. But even in the modern world, these things matter because we have variations in how much social support there is in the environment. Whether it's social support provided by yourselves, your friends, and your family, or whether it's social support that's provided by a government that provides those kinds of features. The data suggests that children that grow up with two parents still tend often to do better because they've got twice as many, individuals providing those resources for them, which is actually one of the things that has been interesting in it over the last 20 or 30 years when people have talked about things like gay marriage, right? And people raising children, it's better to have two parents, regardless of who the parents are, because there's two people to contribute those resources, supervision, stuff, which doesn't mean that single parents don't sometimes do a really good job, but it's a lot harder job for them to do, right? Because they have to provide what two people would have provided, or maybe two people in a village, right? If you've got really supportive family, it can actually make a huge difference. But if you don't, it makes that really tough.
Yeah. You've reminded me to water my girlfriend's plants after this. I have done it in the last week, but I should increase it.
Good plan. It's a good plan.
Yeah. And also with the dog thing, there's a lot of advice I remember people saying when it comes to dating apps and for men to have a picture of them with a pet. And does the data show that actually increases their success on dating apps? Hey guys, first of all, I want to say thank you. There's one person who's been sharing the podcast more than anybody else, and that is you. The only reason why this podcast continues to grow is because you are sharing it. And my only ask is, if this podcast has provided value to you, or you think it'll provide value to somebody else, then if you could send them a DM of the link or a screenshot to the show, that would genuinely make my day. And it's the only way the podcast will continue to grow. That's my only ask of you. Thank you very much.
Research that's been done looking at it suggests it does at least increase the response rate, right? The swiping aspect of it. I don't know whether it, whether it increases the accuracy of them forming relationships, whether they're meant to be short-term or long-term. I'm not sure that the evidence is so clear on that because I'm not sure anybody's done those follow-up studies, but the people who just have them do it in the lab and have people look at images, it actually does make a difference.
Wow, that's incredible. And why is it important in general to know what shapes our personality and our desires, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question because, like, there's a lot of us, I think, that are interested, that are scientists that are just interested in answering questions because we want an answer to the question. We want to understand what shapes behavior. I think it's important maybe when people think that you can change things easily, because some things are very difficult to change, and the cost of changing them could be higher than people want to pay. Like if you find out that a particular trait is mostly genetic. Um, you're not necessarily going to be able to change that with any kind of, you know, um, social intervention or something like that. Think better about what are the circumstances. Now, there are lots of things that are genetic that, and in fact, most things that we would talk about may have genetic, the mechanism itself may be genetic, but there's a lot of environmental input. And I think my favorite example teaching about this is a non-behavioral example because the behavioral ones are always complicated. But just simply from a biological standpoint, right? Something like height is influenced by genes, right? It's very clear that there are genetic differences between people that shape their height, but there are also nutritional differences that influence people's height as well, right? And so that combination of the environment in which an individual grows up in, right, or even their prenatal environment and their genes, they're combining together to produce this end trait. And so when people talk about wanting to see more of a particular type of behavior, it's useful to understand how much of it is in a sense flexible and what environmental aspects of it are flexible. So what can we change in the environment that might produce things? So like here's a really unpleasant example from most people's perspective, but again, I'm going to talk about it in terms of an animal instead of people. Randy Thornhill, many, many years ago, did a lot of research looking at environmentally contingent sexual behavior I think I can remember type of insect, but there's a particular type of fly. And in environments where the males have lots and lots of resources, what they do when they want to mate with a female is they get a dead insect and they bring it to the female and they give her a nice dinner and she eats dinner and they have sex with her while she's eating dinner. And that is the preferred female strategy and the preferred male strategy. If males do not have a lot of insect availability to give as these nuptial gifts, as they're called, and there's a lot of competition between other males, they have an alternative strategy where they'll actually cough up some of the protein that they've eaten themselves and offer that to the female. And females don't like that as well, but they will eat it because it's useful for them in the production of their babies. And again, but they spend less time eating it and the male has to get in there and get his business done faster. So again, not as desirable strategy. If males are poor quality and there's very few insects in the environment, they actually have evolved a little organ that helps them hang on to the female and force her to have sex with them, right?
Wow.
So they will engage in forced sex under that condition. And in the lab, you can just change the environment and get the males to behave differently, right? So it's truly environmentally contingent in that particular insect species. But that's why it's important to understand what is the mechanism and what are the environmental cues that influence it, regardless of what the behavior is. If there's a reason to think you might want to modify the behavior or the people, because it would make everybody happier if the behavior was modified, or even if it might make life easier for individual people if they could behave.
That kind of makes me think of all these atrocities in war as well that don't normally happen under normal circumstances. Like you hear all these stories from World War I and II of like people just being executed. Obviously, the Holocaust. Obviously, like villages being burnt down, and also mass rape and stuff like that. Is that also a big part of that due to the environment? Because a lot of these soldiers who have committed these atrocities would just come back home to a normal family life after the war.
Yeah. I mean, I think there certainly are people who that's the focus of the research is on warfare and what are the circumstances that influence male psychology during war, because again, majority of individuals who are actively competing in war historically have always been male. And yeah, I think there's pretty clear evidence that there are a number of factors about warfare in particular that make it easier sometimes for men to commit different acts that we would consider to be atrocities. Rape certainly is one of them. And I think one of there are a couple of factors that probably influence the fact that that increases. And one is the dehumanization of the enemy that happens during warfare, right? It's hard to kill someone that hasn't. It might be easier if they had personally offended you. Like maybe if they shot you first, you might find it easier to shoot them back. But most people find it really difficult to kill other people. Like we're really interested in studying people who find it easy to do that because we think of it as a problem. But most people don't find that an easy thing to do. And most people who like even accidentally kill somebody suffer a lot of psychological anguish themselves because they did that, right? And so you have to have certain kinds of conditions that would make it easier for people to do that. And so one of them is, okay, actually, if you're competing with people for resources that are very important to your own survival, right? So think about small tribal groups of people ancestrally. In the modern world, we actually have to work hard to get people to be willing to do this because it doesn't have the same immediate consequences for them until they're actually in, the scheme of things, because a lot of battles aren't about you and your neighbor fighting over your land. They're about fighting over somebody else's land or somebody else's resources around the world. And so there's a certain amount of, dehumanization of the enemy that is focused on accentuating the dangers and the evilness of the enemy. But also the consequences are different, right? In the general scheme of things, we have sort of a social contract where if you commit crimes or violate rules, you're punished for them. And that's removed in that situation, right?
Yeah.
If you committed the same crime against your own, somebody on your side, right? Part of your tribe, you're punished harshly for it. If you do it to the enemy, you're not. And for many people in warfare, the other thing is are you even likely to survive to see the end of it, right? If
Yeah.
you don't believe that the odds of you walking home are really high, then your willingness to do a lot of things that you would never do back home, increase, right? Even when they look at things like, people's willingness to pay for sex, right? And look at prostitution. It flourishes around military bases. It flourishes during times of uncertainty and war. Because yes, you might have a partner and you might never think of paying somebody for sex back home. But if you're here and you might die tomorrow, then all of a sudden, that's a very different circumstance. And so I think in general, when we think about sort of the cognitive apparatus that we've evolved to manage social relationships within a group, once you take it outside the group, sometimes it doesn't function. So
Really, really interesting. And it makes not sense, but I was confused about why some of that behavior is so easily occurred. And you've explained it really well. So, yeah.
I think it's disturbing, right? I think to me, one of the things that's most problematic about the fact that sort of we evolved like with this sort of in-group, out-group psychology because of living in small tribal groups and villages is that the more people focus on differences between people, the easier it is for that kind of thinking to become widespread, right? If we focus more on we're all just people, maybe some of that would be less problematic. But I think it's a hard thing to do because I think people just naturally tend to think about their own groups. You can even see it in sports stuff, right? Like think about different sports teams, right? And like getting into brawls at matches and like having really antagonistic ideas towards other people. It's like, but why? Just because, you like this team, you're Manchester versus whatever, it definitely is something that seems to be very easily triggered by the kind of psychology that we.
Yeah. And that's clearly ingrained in us from our past of living in small tribes, right?
I think so. And I think, if we want to find ways to work around it, we need to understand that better. And we need to understand what factors can maybe bypass it to try and reduce that easily triggered aggression. Right.
Yeah.
And right now living in the United States, sometimes it's very apparent that aspects of politics can trigger it as well. Right. And that's a real challenge, I think.
Definitely. And going back to paid sex work and prostitution, what are some possible evolutionary explanations for people getting into paid sex work and pornography, becoming porn stars?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess there's two questions. There's one aspect is why work in the sex industry, and then why are people customers
Mm.
of the industry? Can't really have one without the other. Um, I think it's in some ways. I think actually both have relatively simple answers in some sense, in a broad sense, anyway. If you think about what leads to reproductive success in males, um, obviously, the more partners, the more offspring you could possibly have, right? And if you think about polygynous societies, males who have more than one wife or one partner tend to be more offspring. And so there's been, lots of research for a long time, since the 70s, in particular, talking about how male sexual psychology is in many ways, I wouldn't say it. Sometimes we talk about it like things like dual mating strategy is a term you see used, but it's, if you have long-term mating strategy, you can still entertain short-term mating strategies on the side. And it also may be the case that male sexual psychology might also lend itself to multiple long-term partners like we see in polygynous societies. But in general, the idea that men should find low cost sex with new women appealing is part of a short-term mating strategy, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to engage in short-term mating, there are things that have to be present in your psychology for that to be a successful strategy. And one is enjoying lots of sex, with different people, and that doesn't cost you a lot, because long-term relationships cost you a lot. You have to invest in your partners, right? And that's true even for polygynous long-term mating partners. You have to maintain that, and that costs something. So if those opportunities, the idea is that if those opportunities arose historically, men should have been involved, take advantage of them when they. That's going to mean that in general, sex with novel women should be exciting to men, right? This is the Coolidge effect that they talk about in biology. That you know, if you're mating animals, as soon as you introduce a new female to the male, he gets easily aroused again, even if he's already habituated to the other people previously. And maybe human males are not entirely different in some ways, right? Or at least physiologically, they may have these reactions. And so when you think about pornography, right, working in the pornography industry, if you think about it from the consumer standpoint, this is a smorgasbord. It's low cost. You're just watching an image. You're getting all of the visual stimulation that is part of male sexual psychology, that novel, sexually attractive, young, fertile-looking women, right? This is sort of like a fantasy realm. It doesn't ever happen in the real world, right? You don't walk into an elevator and there's 6 girls who drop to their knees to give you a blowjob. That doesn't happen,
Yeah.
typically in an office building, but it happens in porn all the time, right? So it's a fantasy in that sense, but it's a fantasy that's tapping into, right? And so from the consumer standpoint, right, it's not surprising that there's lots of male consumers that are creating sort of a market for this. Um, and when we think about why women or men might go into the industry, I think there's somewhat different reasons sometimes for men and women, but sometimes they may be similar. One of them is that you might like the opportunity to have sex with lots of people that you might not have the opportunity to have sex with otherwise. Um, and from the standpoint of women historically in the industry, they've tended to get paid relatively well, right? In general, female porn actresses get paid more than male porn actors, other than perhaps in the gay porn industry where really attractive men can make a lot of money. But in general, that there's been a lot more money paid to women working in the industry. They have a short window when they can work in the industry, right? Generally speaking, the mainstream industry is focused on women who are young, so 20s, early 20s, early 30s, maybe. But, by the time she's 50, she's not making porn, except for a specialty market, right? That is interested in older women, right? And there's a lot more of that now that there's a lot more of this online, right? Because you can appeal to everything online. When it was just mainstream market, commercial market, it was much more, constrained range. But it's financial, right? Women are not mostly doing it because I want to have sex with that hot guy. They're doing it because somebody could pay me a lot of money to work for a few hours. And if you look at some of the interviews or some of the data on women working in the industry, women at least when the main industry was the commercial industry, they might have been making $60,000 or $70,000 a year, but they might have been making 1 or 2 films a month. So
Yeah.
it's not a lot of work for the
High
overall.
leverage.
Yeah. And so I think that certainly, I mean, I think finances are why women go into the industry. I think that, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some women who might do it because they actually, do enjoy having sex with lots of different guys, right? There's variation in sexual strategies and sexual interests in women. There's maybe a bit less in men, but there certainly is some in women. And so I think that the women probably who stay in the industry a long time, or at least a few years, are probably women who also enjoy that aspect of it as well. For prostitution, I think in some ways it's very similar. I mean, this is a male market for the most part. It's men buying the services of women or men buying the services of men. I think that there are, in a sense, a couple different reasons that women go into it. Some women are doing it and it's really survival sex, right? They can't make money any other way. They're runaways, they have a drug problem, and they sell sex on the street, which has a lot of really negative consequences and costs for them. But there are certainly women who do that. And that, I mean, they're doing it for financial reasons. There's no other reason particularly for it. But it's not, I'm making a lot of money doing it. It's that I can survive doing this or I can pay for my drug habit. There are also women who work, in the escort industry, who might have relatively few clients and they might be making a lot of money and they might have chosen to do it because they're paying off student loans or they're making a lot of money. There was actually a study done in the UK that was looking at college students. The university wasn't happy when it came out, but it was looking at college students and how many of them were actually working in some version of brothel, indoor prostitution work to pay for their college education, right? And you can imagine why the university didn't like that.
Yeah.
But they were choosing to do it not in a survival sense, but in this is going to make my life easier sense, right? I'm going to school, I'm doing this on the side, and I can make more money doing this on the side to make my life easier. The girls that do escort work, some of them are going to be doing it because they can make a lot of money. And again, it's kind of like some of the women working in the porn industry. I can get a lot of money and I can then do something else too, maybe, or build a different career if I want to, or make enough money that I can, own property or have some other kind of job. I was at a sex researchers conference one time, and one of the speakers was a former exotic dancer who had gone and got a master's degree in economics.
Wow.
That was an interesting combination. But she owned several homes and stuff by the time she had finished her exotic dancing career. So she had done something very smart with her money. And then paid for a good degree as well. So, I mean, in terms of why people do it, I mean, I think sexual psychology is a driver for men and just the desire for cheap sexual opportunities. Although it's also worth pointing out for some men, it might be that they have unusual sexual tastes. And so they're going to go for, maybe you have a partner who doesn't like it and you're paying somebody for it. It might be that you're having difficulty getting a partner, and so you pay for sex to get a partner, or it may be that you only want sex and don't want a relationship. That might be the celebrity version of prostitution. So you're just paying for sex and you don't want any of the trapping. So, I mean, I think, again, that's all coming out of a short-term mating strategy on the part of men. And I think for women, it's, I need resources, whether they're survival resources or other kinds of resources. And this is a market that I can exploit.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And I never thought of the business savvy side of things, especially for the for the student escorts.
I actually think in some ways it's interesting to think about that for women who do that. I mean, even because of the OnlyFans stuff now, right? Like there's been this mainstreaming of some of this adult content, but that people who go into it do need to be really financially savvy because you can make a lot of money, but you can't do that for, like, there's overexposure. You can only do it for so long. But I also think I've also thought about this a lot when I think about sports athletes that become very famous and make a lot of money, that they also need the same financial training, because they often waste their money. And then find out, when they're older, that they have like very little money, because we don't do enough for young people to teach them to be more financially and economically savvy. I feel like that's something our education system needs to do more of with people, not just for people in those areas, but in those areas, I think you can really see the difference between people who've been successful doing it and those who are not successful doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. The rate of technological advancement with the internet and things like that, is the education system hasn't caught up. So the best financial advice is probably found like through stuff like podcasts and online and through courses and stuff,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I don't think we were ever really good at teaching that in like schools or anything ever anyways, but I do think that, there's definitely, because I think younger people don't know that they need to look into that stuff. But I agree with you. I think that the best education is going to be found through online sources for stuff like that nowadays.
yeah. And then obviously with like online access, there's going to be some upsides and a lot of downsides too. And that leads me to ask, what are the effects of pornography use for teenagers, for people watching a lot of porn? How can that affect their relationships or their brain? Because speaking from experience, I probably watched a bit too much porn when I was a teenager. So how could that affect our mating strategies and our attraction to people and our brains, from what you've researched?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very complicated question. Actually, I don't think it's as straightforward as it often gets played out in the media, which is that kids watch too much porn and it makes them messed up in terms of their sex lives or their relationships. I do think that because I mean, it's not that people didn't used to watch porn before the internet or look at dirty magazines or whatever. I do think that in general, right, overexposure to media images of beautiful people is probably a bit problematic. And the way that it's problematic is that our brains aren't really designed to understand that everything that you see is not actually a mating opportunity, right? If you grow up in a town of 2,000 people, pretty much everybody that you see, it may be a possible mating opportunity for you in your small town. And everybody is probably going to be, getting exposed to the full picture of those individuals, right? But with the media, whether it's social media, whether it's film, whether it's pornography, whether it's online or offline, you really only see the most beautiful people in the most beautiful presentation. And your brain is thinking, well, I could have that. And it's like, right. So if you're thinking about like the idea that our mate preferences and what we actually think we can get on the mating market is influenced by what we perceive the mating market to be, the one individual person's mating market is not the next person's mating market, because you're constrained by your own mate value, right? Like tools don't usually end up in long-term relationships with 10. But if all you see online and stuff is 10, so I think that's one way in which we've got some evidence that even predates the internet from people like Doug Kenrick, that overexposure to images of beautiful women for men causes them to downgrade the attractiveness of their partner, right? If all you see are beautiful people, then what you used to think of as your beautiful partner might not be quite as beautiful as you thought she was, right? From your perspective. So that could be an issue. And likewise for women, if all you see are wealthy in the high status men, all of a sudden you might think that that's what you should have, because that's what your actual market availability includes. And that's, again, it's not realistic, right? It's not, so I mean, one way I used to talk about this is to say that people really worry about what porn tells men they can have. And I think you should be equally worried about what romance novels tell women they can have. Neither of these are necessarily realizable fantasies for anybody, right? So to the extent that I think it can skew our perceptions of the mating market, I think it can be problematic. I think the data on things like whether it affects violence against women are much less clear. I think that the best data probably suggests that for men that are already disposed to be aggressive towards women because they have hostile masculinity, um, or something like that, the work of people like Neil Almus, um, that suggests that there's a very small group of men that it may actually have negative effects for, but for the majority of men, it doesn't. They've done really interesting studies where they've actually presented images. Well, I think he actually like with soundtracks where and things where men in general don't like images that suggest that the women are not enjoying themselves, right? Like then in general, and even some data that I've collected, where we had Jess Keeman and I did some studies looking at people's perceptions of sexual images, shows that the affect matters. Like guys like it when women are really enjoying themselves in those kinds of films. And so I think from that standpoint, I think most of the evidence I've seen suggests that, for the majority of men, it's not having negative effects in terms of how they treat women. But I do think it is skewing their perception of what is a beautiful woman to something that is definitely more attractive than the average make, cool, and learn. And I would also argue that films and romance novels and erotica can do the same thing for women. And, maybe they all think they can get, well, I shouldn't say Brad Pitt because that dates me, but some young hot guy that the girls today think is beautiful, that they all think that that's what they can have. And that's not any more realistic than thinking that every guy can have, you know, uh, whatever porn star they think is hot.
Yeah. And how are these men portrayed in the dark romance novels, and why are women drawn to that from an evolutionary perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I think that for all that today you hear a lot of discussion of things like toxic masculinity, the reality is that women are attracted to men who are masculine. That's kind of what it means to say that you're attracted to men, right? That you're attracted to things that are indicators of masculinity. And many of the things like being physically strong or being assertive are things that lead to success in physical competition, but also in terms of like workplace and status competition, right? Which doesn't mean that the guy goes in a workplace and punches somebody in the face, but he has a sense of assertiveness, right? Like there are guys when they walk into a room, you just have a feeling that guy, like if things went south, this is somebody who would be, whether they were physically or whether they were, psychologically capable person, right? And those are men that women would have historically found attractive because they would have been good protectors, good dads, good social ties, writers. I think women still find those men attractive. Now, that doesn't mean they want somebody who's going to grab them by the hair and drag them around the room. They want somebody who's going to do that to anybody who threatens them or their children. But they also want a guy who's going to be loving and caring towards them and their children. And so a lot of times when you think about dark romance or the appeal of vampires or any of these kinds of fictional, sort of tropes, a huge part of it is that these males are like, in a sense, almost mesmerized by the female, the heroine in those stories. Like they can't control their own desire to have her, their attraction to her, but it's also partially their commitment to her, right? And so for men and women, that I think is very appealing. The idea that there's something about you that is particularly special to a guy that is also highly desirable, right? And so I think that's part of it. And I think that, the more we've seen society sort of, sort of downgrade certain aspects of masculinity, yet female genres have elevated that at the same time. You can even think about it in really odd sort of situations. Like think about the popularity of characters like Dexter. One might have once thought that characters like, serial killers would be of interest to men more than women. But a serial killer who kills the bad guys seems to be very appealing to women. But again, that's like a predator that is going to be a good protector at the same time, right? And I think especially when women might perceive their environment as more threatening, they may be especially attracted to those kind of males. And I think there's some data from some studies that were done a number of years ago. It was Carlos Navarrete and maybe Dan Fessler did some work showing that women in more violent neighborhoods, for example, I think they might have done some of the work here in California, but women who were living in more violent neighborhoods actually valued male physical prowess and aggressiveness more in a partner. And it's because you actually need it more in those environments, right? And so again, it's pointing out, I think one of the things that also is really good to keep in mind, again, when we mentioned it earlier, right? When we think about evolutionary explanations, you have mechanisms, right? Psychological mechanisms that shape stuff, but they're sensitive to the environment. And women in really benign environments might not value that as much as women who are living in environments where it might be more beneficial to them.
Yeah. Do nice guys always finish last?
I don't think that's true. I mean, I think that you can be too nice, right? And I think that you can be too nasty, right? I mean, I think this goes back to discussions of things like health as well, right? Like the extremes are not always the ideal in many ways. I think that you do not want to be so nice that you're taken advantage of, right? By your friends, by your family, by your partner. But you also don't want to be so harsh that you're unattractive as a partner or as a social, as a friend, right? Or a social ally. There is a balance to be had in terms of being generous and and you know of being seen as generous by your partner and by your friends, and being seen as somebody who can be taken advantage of and walked on. So I don't think, I think, I don't think that's that nice guys finish last. I think it's that there's a risk to being, um, to not, discriminating in your own interactions with other people. Right. And actually, I like thinking about that in terms of larger applications. I mean, people like Gad Saad have talked about what he calls suicidal empathy, right? That you can be too nice and this can be a problem, right? If you're so nice that you let people come into your home and they take advantage of you or whatever, that's a problem. Uh, but the opposite extreme is also. So
Yeah.
I think if we think about the social environment in which humans evolve, we did evolve for small group interactions. I think one of the challenges is that in small group interactions, everybody knows everybody, reputation gets spread amongst the group, right? And so you don't, it's safe to be a nice guy because you know who the people are that are problems and you know who the people are who are nice guys, right? It works out really well. In the modern world, we don't always have that same kind of information, and you can't always trust the information that you get on social media about stuff like that anyways. But the bigger the city, the less people that you see that you know very much about, the easier it is to get taken advantage of, and the easier it is for people to take on those sort of predatory strategies and get away with it. So it makes it a more
Mm.
challenging problem to solve, I think.
Yeah. And do you know what causes someone to be a nice guy from their upbringing or genetics, and what are some evolutionary reasons for why it can be seen as less attractive?
Well, I think there's probably a combination of things. I don't know that anybody has a really great assessment of how much of people's like altruistic or nice guy nature is uh, due to genes versus due to the upbringing versus due to the environment that they're in. I mean, circumstances also play a role in that. I mean, there is, so I can give you one like tiny bit, because this is one of the only little tiny bits I know much about in that area, is that birth order is one of those things that seems to influence a little bit, that middle children seem to be a little bit more empathetic. And I think it's actually the most recent thing that I'd ever published that dealt with birth order stuff, because I did a lot of that really early on in my career and a lot less of it more recently. But I've been interested in looking at people's attitudes towards animals and things that influence their treatment of animals. And middle children it's a small effect, but they do seem to be a bit more empathetic towards them, especially domestic animals. and how they're treated. So, I mean, I think there are some interesting sort of early environment things that can influence that. But I think there are some things that are probably genetic, right? Like if you think about people who have really like dark triad, like psychopaths and things like that, I think a lot of that probably is genetic, and probably relatively little of it is environment, right? There's all sorts of examples of people who have those kinds of tendencies, who've done horrible things and grew up in completely normal families. But there are also some that grew up in dysfunctional families, right? And so again, it's really difficult to parse some of that stuff out. But in terms of why people would be kind and nice and cooperative, again, it's like we evolved in small groups. Cooperation matters, right? It's like the ability to get along with people, to form social groups. That kind of support is really important to us, right? It would have been important historically, whether we're living on the savannah or wherever. But it's also important now. People who have really strong social networks have better mental health. They've got people who are able to support them if things happen. Somebody loses a job, somebody suffers a relationship breakup. You have social support, and that is a huge difference. But you only have social support if you're cooperative, right? If you're altruistic with your own friends. And so I think we have very significant adaptations to encourage cooperation within our own social groups. Now, people who extend their altruism towards people they don't even know, that is, I think, a larger, interesting question, right? About what motivates people. And some people have talked about it being like like an advertisement, right? If I'm really good to people in general, then I'm the kind of nice person that other people should want to be friends with, right? It could be an advertisement, and that could be an honest advertisement, or it could be a dishonest advertisement, right?
Can
When
be
people talk
often a
about virtue
dishonest one.
signaling, they're usually talking about
Yeah.
a dishonest signal, but it can be an honest signal as well, right? And there could be reasons for people motivated to do those kinds of things. Understanding why people do this and what shapes people doing this in the absence of any social benefit is a different question. But you could imagine looking at people who are philanthropic and give big donations to places. And very often they have buildings named after them. But there are also people who make big donations and don't make it public, or they do them anonymously. And there's probably something different going on in those cases, right? Because there's a benefit that is very clear in one of them, and the benefit in the other one is less clear. Although it may be that we are just designed, right, to be cooperative and altruistic with these small groups, and that in the modern world, sometimes in a sense, maybe it misfunctions, and we are altruistic towards people more broadly, right? Just because it feels good to us, right? Like if you do something nice for somebody, it may have originally, evolved because everybody that you lived with was part of a group, but even now you still behave that way in the modern world, even though, you don't know anybody. You're holding the door open for somebody, not because there's a benefit to you, but because, that's just what you do to people in your community, right? You're nice to people that you interact with. And when we extend it to a broader range of individuals now.
Yeah. And if you're on a first date, if you compare I say nice guy, but just the less assertive, less confident, maybe the anxious guy versus not the complete opposite like we've been discussing, but the more assertive, the slightly more dominant, the slightly more kind of charismatic man, why would the more charismatic man tend to probably have a better success on that first date? What does it signal from an evolutionary perspective if you're a bit more assertive, a bit less anxious and
Right.
like?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of things that might signal. I mean, one of the things that it might signal is just status, right? Whether that status is achieved through dominance or prestige, either way, if your confidence is signaling status, it's signaling ability to acquire resources, ability to be a provider in that way. I mean, some of it can just be that. If you think about the range of things that people might be advertising in terms of mating, again, good genes, physical strength, attractiveness, resource acquisition abilities. And the resource acquisition abilities, sometimes when people are younger, right, you don't have a lot of resources yet. You're still in college, whatever. But you may give signs of traits that are associated with the ability to acquire them, which would include things like confidence and assertiveness and things like that. And so I suspect that a lot of it is that it's like that we're sort of tracking whatever translates to status in our own communities, right? And because the status is what led to resources, over historical time. And so today's, for somebody, that might be just money or things like the kind of car a guy drives or whatever. But that wouldn't have been what it would have been historically, right? It would have been things like being confident, being assertive, and being able to provide dinner, whether you went out, killed it, or and cooked it yourself, or whether you took somebody to a nice place to eat. There's a variety of ways in which people can sort of demonstrate capabilities that are important. So I suspect that's why, or at least that's one of the reasons why confidence is something that's seen as being attractive. I mean, I suspect there probably is a little bit of a sweet spot between not wanting to seem overconfident and not being too anxious, right? Like if you're too anxious, then you might be thinking that the guy's high neuroticism, which is generally a little bit concerning. But you don't want him to be so overconfident that like he gives off asshole vibes, right? There's a sweet spot between those extremes.
And how does overconfidence, how does that, from an evolutionary perspective, make you less attractive? Is it because you have a higher chance of being kicked out the tribe if you're a bit of an asshole?
Well, I mean, it could, but I think it also could be more that for women, it might, it may not. The only reason, so from the male perspective, another guy who's overconfident, it only matters if it's an overestimation of his actual abilities. If he really is as good as he thinks he is, then you want him to be your buddy, and to be part of your group, because that's a benefit to the mobility of the success of your group. From a female perspective, the one risk with men who see themselves as very high in mate value is they often are less faithful partners. If they have lots of other ways of diverting their resources to other matings. And so again, I think women's own mate value may influence how they perceive that. If she's really confident that she's a 10, maybe she's okay with that. But the average woman is probably going to be okay. Is he, there's going to be some of this weighting is he so much, overinflated sense of self, whatever, that he's going to cheat, right? And I think that is a risk, because the cheating for men is more than being associated with their attractiveness. It tends to be associated with their status, right? Really high status men, often are more likely to be, committed infidelity. And so I think that women who are interested in long-term mating are going to care about that. If all she wants is a short-term fling, maybe she doesn't care. And maybe it's really attractive. But I think if she's interested in the long-term, that can be a problem.
Definitely.
Or at least perceived as being.
Yeah, I guess it does depend on what your incentive is as well. And that made me think of insecurity. What are the adaptive reasons for insecurity? Are there actually benefits to being insecure? Is it increase your chance of holding on to that partner or holding on to them resources, or motivate you to get more resources or more partners?
Yeah, I mean, I think the motivation aspect of things can be part of it. So if you're motivated to invest more in your partner, that then, shows your partner that you're really highly invested in the relationship, right? And that can, for women, that can give them that sense that this person's committed to, right? And often when they talk about, men who are concerned about their partner's infidelity, maybe because there's a big mate value discrepancy or something, they talk about men who are able to provide incentives, wanting to provide lots of incentives, right? and that men who are not able to provide incentives are the ones that would need to worry about, because they're the ones who might be more likely to result to aggression towards her or towards other people in terms of, trying to prevent her from maybe leaving the relationship. And so, a certain amount of a certain amount of insecurity, if it motivates you to demonstrate your value as a partner, is probably a good thing. If you have so much insecurity that you're hypervigilant and you're imposing costs, that's obviously going to be a problem, right? And it's going to be perceived in a negative way, whether it's a man or a woman doing it, right? If it's a woman who's really insecure and if the guy goes anywhere without her, she's freaking out, it's an issue. And it is the other way as well, right? You want people to be invested in the relationship. But you don't want somebody to be so insecure that they're actually imposing costs on the relationship.
Why does that happen then? Why is that not super prevalent, but it's, I'm sure everyone knows that kind of crazy person in relationships, why is it expressed regardless of?
I think sometimes it's because there actually is a real mate value discrepancy. Like everybody wants to get, like the best mate they can, maybe. But sometimes I think if people end up mismatched for whatever reason, it can create insecurity or make insecurities worse. And sometimes you can get into a relationship and it seems really good in terms of being kind of equal on mate value, but then something happens and it's not, right? So there's something that happens that affects somebody's mate value, whether it's losing a job, whether it's some other kind of change. And then things don't seem quite the same, right? Like if you look at some of the literature on like things like spousal abuse and spousal homicide, often the relationship is fine. And then there's something that changes. And all of a sudden, somebody's very insecure about the relationship. And sometimes, they're not able to provide incentives and then they create all these detriments, right? And so I think that can be one reason that we see it. And you could see that in, like, that's an example of how it might play out if a guy has a drop in status. But you could see if a guy had a sudden gain in status, that his female partner might be like, oh, no, this is not so good. I mean, it's good that he's so successful, but it's not so good that he's so successful. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that those insecurities can become problematic, right? Is that a little bit of it, caring about the other person being invested in the relationship is important. But if you have a situation where there have been big imbalances that are created, then I think it can exacerbate insecurities.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And has there been any studies on when someone in the relationship, like you just used an example, if a male suddenly gained more status, say they became more wealthy, they got a promotion, or they became famous, or even more successful, they blew up, and their status increased massively. Are there any studies on maybe the other partner's reaction and change? Are there changes in dating strategies? Do they become more open to having children, for example?
I haven't seen that's interesting because I really haven't seen research looking at it. Part of the problem would be how would you track it, right? In that kind of, with that being the outcome, because you'd have to track them from before they were successful to afterwards, right? So you'd have to you could maybe theoretically do it. You could take a cohort of guys and follow them over time and look at something like that. But I mean, often we don't become aware of those situations until retrospectively. And then what we see is things about divorce, and it's a very anecdotal case study stuff. With the homicide stuff and the decreases in status, that stuff, it provides nice data because you have all of the police information so that you can look at what actually was going on. Because typically people actually do articulate that stuff. And there's a lot of information on battered women's shelters and the women who end up there that gives you information about how circumstances have changed in relationships. But yeah, I mean, it'd be great if you could track people who were just ordinary people who became famous athletes, the Tiger Woods and whatevers of the world, right? Or somebody who, becomes a very successful performer, or somebody, even like somebody in the military who's just a regular Joe who becomes very powerful. How do their partners respond to this? And my guess is a lot of it would depend again on the actual self-perceived mate value of the part. Not even what her male partner thinks, but what she thinks, because it's really, does she think that this is a risk? Because even part of the problem, at least that you see it in the reverse situation where there's been a drop in status with women, is that the men may think she's going to leave, or they think she's going to cheat, when she really isn't thinking about doing it. It's just that they're much more concerned about it. And so it's your own perceptions that they actually may matter more, because there's two separate questions. There's the question, does the guy actually, when he gets much more status, reevaluate his choices and trade up, right, as they say? Or is it just that relationships fall apart because the other partner becomes far more insecure and unhappy in the relationship, and then creates situations where the other person isn't willing to deal with the costs? And I'm not sure that we have good data on that, but I do think it would be really interesting, although maybe challenging to study question.
Yeah, I guess it would be anecdotal, wouldn't it? You'd ask them after it, but that's not that reliable.
Yeah, because most divorce information that you get is not going to give you that kind of stuff. I mean, you'd have to, maybe if you were like a marriage counselor, you could get some of that data. If you worked in that field, you could actually look at people who are coming in and look at how often that's a problem. I mean, some of the sexual jealousy literature suggests that kind of stuff has been going on. But again, a lot of the studies are clean in the way that we might want them to be from that longitudinal standpoint. But retrospectively, those kinds of issues are getting brought up a lot in some of the sexual jealousy stuff. So some of the stuff that David Buss has published about over the last 20 or 30 years touches on some of that.
Yeah. And there's often a common pattern when it comes to people going from nothing to super famous. The 27 Club, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, or they just fall off and fall into drugs and drug abuse and things like that. Why, from an evolutionary perspective, we clearly crave recognition and status, but why in the modern day can't our brains seem to deal with it that well for many people? Why is there no, I don't know, just evolved strategy to cope with so much attention?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've not really thought about that question very much before, but sort of my kind of first pass take on it is that the scale is so different now. I mean, we often talk about the mismatch between the ancestral environment and the modern environment, right? And how, social media being one example, right, in the attractiveness issue. But when we think about what it would have been to, like, what it would have meant to have had status or being really popular in the ancestral environment, it's not anything like the scale of what we're talking about now, right? If you think about famous people now, like, you can't go anywhere without people recognizing you if you're really famous in a celebrity kind of way, right?
Yeah.
And that would never have really been the case historically. Like, even if you were really famous, you were famous amongst, a few thousand people. So you had status and everybody would say hi to you or recognize you, but it wasn't like this kind of, sense that everybody cares what your business is. Everybody's evaluating you. Everybody's critiquing you. Everybody's got an opinion. And I think the biggest problem are people who listen to the opinion. Because especially, for women, like, a lot of the critique will be about the way you look, right? And so then you run into all these plastic surgery things and people doing all this kind of stuff. And it's like, and then they just look fucked up, right? Eventually, because you just get too much stuff done. And, but you would never before, like, you couldn't change it if you wanted to change it, right? So some of it is that we have like all of these things that we can do to so-called fuck ourselves up that were not present in the ancestral environment, right? We have way more people weighing in on stuff, and their opinion seems to matter, even though you're never going to interact with them. And again, that as originally everybody's opinion didn't matter because you were going to interact. Now somebody online can say that you're this and you're this or that and whatever, and it affects you because you're still taking it personally because that's the environment that we were in. But again, it's like, it doesn't, I mean, it doesn't matter. Cat needs to get out of the way. So I think that's part of the problem, right? Is just the scale is ramped up to a level that we are not adapted to deal with. I think that again, status means something different now. I think that it means resources and attention that we might have thought would make us happy, but do we really understand what makes people happy? I'm not sure that people. So here's my take on it for whatever it's worth. I don't think people evolved to be happy. I don't think natural selection drives us to be more happy. It drives us to reproduce, right? And so things that lead to reproduction are often the things that make us happy. If you talk to older people in their 80s and 90s, what makes them happy? What made them happy? Their children, their grandchildren. Ozzy Osbourne recently passed away. You see all the pictures of him with his family. I'm sure that what made him happy in the end was his children and grandchildren, right? That's what gives life meaning. That's what tends to make us happy. Status is a way to get to that, but status in and of itself tends not to make people happy, right? I mean, it's nice to have money and it's nice to have people admire you, but in the end, is that what makes people happy? I don't know that the research suggests that it does, right? So, I mean, in a sense, natural selection has shaped all of these adaptations for survival and reproduction, but not necessarily to make us happy. So I'm not sure that we're really good at better than others, right? I mean, and some people become very successful and they seem to stay mentally healthy, but there are a lot of them are the people who stay away from the limelight and the social media aspect of things as well. Like if you think about Hollywood people that tend to be, that stay away from drugs and stay away from alcohol and stay with their partners and stuff, they tend to be the ones who have stayed away from the limelight in a broader sense. And I think that if you listen too much to the mob, that's a huge downfall for people. And I think that in that sort of, if you thought that it was going to make you happy and you got it and it didn't make you happy, that's going to be the pathway to drugs and alcohol abuse that's going to end up with, dead before their times people as well. Because even just looking at like years and years ago now, I did a study with a couple colleagues, Jess Keeman and John Townsend, on hooking up on campuses and hookup culture and people's reactions to it, whether people were happy or whether it caused depression, right? Or made people more anxious. And a lot of people said, well, guys are happy and girls are unhappy about it. And maybe, but really the main reason some girls were unhappy with it is because they wanted a long-term relationship and that's not what they got, right? They hooked up with the guy thinking maybe it'll work out. And the guy didn't call the next day kind of thing. And so it's a mismatch between the motivation and then the behavior, right? And so if what you think is going to make you happy doesn't make you happy or doesn't get what you wanted, then I think it's even more likely to cause things like depression.
Yeah. And it seems with that example, you're expecting yourself to be happy after it and because of it, but also to have subconsciously, maybe kind of subconsciously, evolutionary mating success from it as well, because if you're having that hookup, that's going to increase your chance of having offspring. If you don't want it in that exact moment, I guess subconsciously you're going to get rewarded for that, but then you're also getting the happiness as well, you expect the happiness as well, and it doesn't end up happening. So does your mind always trick you with the motivation?
Yeah. I don't know whether it's so much tricking you, but I think that, you know, when, so if I think that one of the differences, so for say, for example, for guys, again, like if some of what you're interested in is just sexual opportunity, then that thing is a good deal, right? Like, I mean, yeah, that's a good filter to have. But if women are sort of just, they're at that stage of life where they may still be exploring a little bit, but they're also starting to get interested in the long-term mating. And maybe they think this guy is a good option. And they're thinking maybe if the sex is good, then, you know, maybe this is going to turn out into something else, and it doesn't, then that means you didn't get the goal you wanted. So it's like, what is your goal in engaging in the behavior? And if it's just sex, then then you're going to be happy. But if it's more than just sex and that more doesn't materialize, then I think it's more likely to result in things like depression. And I think it can be even worse for women if the sex is really good. Because if the sex is really good and you get that big oxytocin bump from a nice orgasm, and it makes you kind of feel attached to the guy, and then he doesn't call you, that probably is even worse, right? So your physiology may not be helping you. I mean, the best case scenario would be if you hook up with a guy who isn't going to call, but you have bad sex with him. And then you think, oh yeah, that's good because he was a loser anyways, and it wasn't good sex. Really good sex and the sort of oxytocin bump that comes with it probably makes that even worse as a situation if he doesn't.
Yeah. And in that situation, a woman going into it hoping for the long-term relationship of establishing that beforehand, before they have the hookup, is that the mistake as well?
Well, you know, some people do have hookups and they do develop long-term relationships from them, right? I mean, I don't know that it's the most common way, but it's certainly a way that it can happen. And so, but I do think that, you know, having those expectations and having them not met is always going to be a negative, right? And again, it's just the same sort of thing. If you think being a rock star and having everybody love you is going to make you happy and it doesn't, like, I mean, then what do, right? This goal that you set for yourself is not giving you what you thought it would. And again, it's like, I think, you know, a better understanding of, you know, what evolution can shape and what it doesn't shape, right? I think can be helpful in understanding why some things are much easier to achieve than others. I think it's a lot easier to achieve status in many ways than it is to achieve happiness. You can work hard enough, you can develop skills, you can sacrifice to obtain status. Even to attain beauty, you can do all sorts of cosmetic things and you can achieve beauty. But to become happy is something that's entirely different. And I don't think that, you know, we have adaptations that are well designed to achieve that, other than that in general, people who have families and invest in children tend to derive happiness. Where even people who say can't have children and they invest in their siblings' children, for example, achieve happiness in that. Or people who invest in their pets are achieving happiness through that because it's kind of working in the same way, right? They're in many cases, they treat their pets like they would children, even when they dress them up and things like that, right? Like, I mean, that's like, it's creating a pseudo relationship and that may give them happiness, right? In the same kind of way. But I think we're sort of more designed to do things that the things that we enjoy often are the things that lead to status and reproductive success.
Yeah.
And, but again, do they make us happy? Sometimes, but not always. And not if they don't give us sometimes the family parts of
Yeah. I guess it's the difference between dopamine versus maybe serotonin, oxytocin, that kind of achievement and reward versus fulfillment, right?
right. And I think that what makes anybody happy at one particular point in time, whether that has a long-term effect or not, I don't know. Because I think there's lots of things that will give us happiness in the moment, right? But to imagine humans as a long-term, like if you were just happy all the time, I'm not sure that the motivational system is really designed to like be that way. Because if you were just
Yeah.
like completely fulfilled all the time, would you do anything?
Probably
Like,
not.
I
No.
mean,
Yeah.
if you were perfectly happy, would you just sit in your garden or around your pool or whatever and just do nothing? I mean, it seems like humans are more designed to strive.
Mm.
And to strive, you have to be striving for something, but that also means you can't be completely satisfied with your current state. So, I kind of wonder, and I also sometimes wonder if that's why often older people seem happier, is because they've already sort of done all their striving and they have that sense of success. And there's less striving, so there's more happiness.
There's more room for it.
Yeah, that the striving that we have for so long pushes other stuff out. But
Yeah.
I mean, if we weren't designed to do that, we wouldn't achieve the things we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it's also how we define happiness ourselves. And that's obviously a bit nuanced, depends on the person. Like if you're clinically depressed, then maybe not. But for me, I try and define happiness as the absence of negative emotion. And that's kind of helped me reframe it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I mean, I certainly would think of I don't know whether I think of myself as a happy person, but I think of myself as somebody who's pretty content most of the time, or pretty relaxed about things. I'm not an anxious person. I'm not like a depressed type person. I can be an annoyed person. So the annoyances of life tend to irritate me. California means traffic. I find that irritating, right? Like there's those things.
Yeah.
But I think also that, you know, most, I mean, I do think there is currently a bit of a problem with probably a little bit with how we define things like depression and anxiety and when we think it's a problem and when it's not a problem, especially with anxiety, because I think a little bit of anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
You should care about what other people think to a certain extent. And you should care about doing a good job. Should you care about it so much that you're paralyzed with fear? No. Like there's a point in which it becomes incapacitating, but there's also a little bit like if you get up in front of an audience to speak, right? If you're at a conference and you're going to speak to like 5,000 people and you don't have a little anxiety, there's something odd about you, or you are that overconfident person, right? I mean, because you do, like you're like your heart beats faster. That's not a bad thing because it motivates you, right? And that level of it is really good. And I think that's why also it's sometimes concerning when people say anxiety is bad, depression's bad. If you just sometimes feel depressed, then would you ever feel happy? Like, I mean, there has to be a range of things, right? And some things should make you feel less positive affect, right? The death of a loved one, you shouldn't be happy at that unless maybe it's a release from pain, right? And maybe you're happy under that circumstance. But if somebody you love is killed in a car accident, you should feel that sucks. And I think if you can't have the range of emotions, that's a problem. That's one of the things I think is one of the challenges of people who have, say, for example, bipolar, right? You want to control, but you still want to have the range in a sense. You just don't want the extremes. And that's a challenge to do on medication, right? And I think it's one of the reasons that many people with bipolar are not adherent to their medication.
Yeah.
Because you want the highs. It's just that those lows can be problematic. And sometimes those extreme highs, you can be kind of not so well behaved during. So I think, when it comes to like happiness, and people should think about like maybe in terms of a gradation, like, I mean, in general, we have some sort of range of positive to negative in terms of our emotional valence. And anything that's, from the midpoint up is a good thing. And maybe things from the midpoint down flag things that we might want to change, right? Because if you're unhappy about things, you need to change things, right? As much as you can. And I think that's when depression becomes really problematic. So when people can't change the things that are making us, right?
Yeah.
You have a terminal illness and you can't change that. Or you have something else about your life that you're stuck in a bad marriage and you really don't think you can leave it for whatever reason. That's going to be a problem. But there's lots of things that make us feel depressed that we can change. We're overweight. You can change it. You can. It's hard work, but you can change it. And I think that that's one of the things that that people need to keep in mind when we think about, like, everybody should be happy all the time. It's like, it's good that we can actually have the input that tells us about things we want to change as well.
Exactly. It's just like an indicator. It's like it's our body telling us something's wrong, something needs to change a lot of the time. I'm sure you've probably seen that bell curve graph with anxiety versus performance. I remember studying it in psychology where I don't know if it was test scores or something, where if you had no anxiety, your test score was pretty bad. Then if you had too much anxiety, your test score was also terrible. And then in the middle, the people with a moderate amount of anxiety before the exam actually performed best. So that's just evidence for why anxiety can be a good thing, really.
There's a sweet spot, right, where there's motivation of performance. And I think that's probably true for a lot of emotional states. If you think about emotions as being things that motivate us to engage in different kinds of behavior, the whole range should be useful, right? Now, maybe in the modern world or under certain circumstances or environments, you can have the extremes that are problematic. But in general, that range should be motivating us to change things or to do more of the same, right? Depending on what kind of state it's creating.
Definitely. And going back to a bit more about the middle child, what's unique about them and how and why is their role in the family different often?
I mean, I think, so, well, I mean, dealing with the last part first, why their role in the family is, different or unique. It's largely because when you think about how parental investment works, right? So you have your first child, you got one child, there's a lot of investment. It goes to just that child because they're the only one you have at the current time. You have another child, pop along. Okay. Now you've got two kids. So they've divided attention in terms of dealing with them. So the first one loses some attention. Second one gets some attention. If you have then another child, okay, then again, you're getting a dilution of attention. Now, if you only have three, typically that baby will also have a period where they get a lot more attention because they're the baby. They're the last one, the last opportunity to invest. And so what it tends to create is the kind of thing we've been talking about. This is a bell-shaped curve where the middle child never really has the sole focus of their parents in terms of attention. Now, from some people's perspective, that's a bad thing, but one could also argue that it's a good thing because you are not getting quite as much parental control either. So firstborn children often have very high parental expectations. This is my child who's going to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, right? And the baby of the family often does get treated like a baby, often for longer, maybe than even ideal. But the middle child or middle children, if you have a bunch of them, are often, they have less expectations, but they're also not babied as much, which means they may get less investment or attention, but it may also mean that they're freer. They're freer to explore what they want. In a sense, they're freer or they need to negotiate more for what they want with their siblings. They're not the biggest and the strongest, so they can't just grab what they want. They learn to negotiate more, I think, because of that. I think because they have to negotiate, they're good at figuring out what other people want to get what they want, which can mean that they're again, good negotiators. But they also tend to be very empathetic, I think, because they see themselves sometimes as not getting as much attention. And so they're more understanding of other people in that sense. So to me, I mean, I think some of the benefits of that role is you can look at some famous political figures that were really amazing negotiators. Anwar is one that just comes to mind, but they're middle children and from big families where there was a lot of negotiating that needed to happen. I think when it comes to things like, being freer, they're freer to figure out what they need and want, but that makes them often more open. Like they're more often open to experiences, like different experiences, which helps them find things that they're really good at. You don't want to be doing the same thing as your older sibling and competing on the same playing field. That just sucks. But that sort of, I think, can lead to them being more innovative, right? And so you can think about people who created, who've been innovative in technology, Bill Gates, Carly Fiorina. There's a bunch of people that, have been sort of outside the box thinkers that have come out of that middle child niche. And a lot of comedians for whatever reason, which I think is kind of interesting. But I think that there's definitely much more structured roles for first and last, right? And, I think about that in terms of my own sibship. I am an older brother, and there's big age gap. And he definitely is very much firstborn child. He follows the rules. He's always very smart, very studious, but definitely more adherent to parental expectations and things like that. I was the baby. I was different sex. It was a lot later. So there's 7 years between us. And I was treated as the baby of the family forever. Now, that didn't mean that in some sense our lives were super different. We both went to university. We both went to graduate school, but he's an engineer. So his PhD is in engineering and my PhD is in psychology, which are very different. And I definitely, differences in willingness to follow the rules and things like that. Although I don't know that I'm quite as freewheeling as many middle children are, but definitely, I think that if you think about what are the pressures that kids are sort of expected, like what are the parental expectations that you need to fulfill? They're much more specific for first and last, especially if your first is a boy. Sometimes if your first boy is a middle child, they get treated like a firstborn child. But the middle children, especially if they have other siblings of the same sex, definitely have a different role to make themselves stand out from the crowd. And that shapes some of those aspects of their personality. It's not everything. I mean, either. I think it's worth pointing out that, if we talk about personality traits, about 50% are genes and about 50% are environment. So some of it is like, this is the way you're going to be anyways. But there's movement that happens due to the environment that you grew up in. And part of that environment is peers and part of that environment is siblings.
It's really interesting. And talking about the negotiation thing, I always remember when my dad would get angry. So my dad always would like kind of lose his temper, but it'd like 9.9 times out of 10 would be at my older sister, who was a lot like him, or my younger brother, who's very stubborn, and it was rarely to me. And I remember when he'd argue with them and get upset or angry and just sit on the sofa, and I would always naturally just go to him and try and calm him down. And it would always piss off my third sibling. Is that middle child behavior?
Yeah, and I mean, there's lots of interesting stuff, and I mean, again, it's not that because sometimes when you talk to people about that, they'll say, "Well, I have a middle sibling and they're not like this," or "I'm a firstborn child and I'm not like that." There's always exceptions, right? Because again, some of your personality is your genes, it's from the environment, and the experience of like, say, for example, like a high IQ firstborn and a low IQ firstborn is going to be different because they're going to realize or not realize parental expectations differently. Same for if you've got a parent who wants that firstborn son to be a football player and they're not going to be, that changes that relationship, right? And in some ways, that's why I would argue the pressures are the worst for the first, because whatever the parental expectations are, you don't meet them, it's a lot harder on you. And it damages the relationship often in some ways. For middles, I mean, often the trick is that you're not necessarily always going to be the first focus with parents, but it may make the relationship easier if your own expectations are not too high. Like if you do not develop like bitterness because you're not the sole focus, it actually can make for an easier relationship, I think. Because again, the expectations aren't the same, but I don't know. I feel like you learn to share better. I think in general, some things are easier when you have siblings. Some of those especially the modern environment, actually, because we don't like have group play in the way that people used to in small towns and villages.
Mhm.
You know, who are your first peers? They're your siblings in the nuclear household in a way that they might not have been living in a village, or even if you had really large kinship networks that live close together. Like I have a lot of cousins, and some of my cousins are kind of like siblings because we're closer in age than I am to my brother. Um, and we lived within a short drive of each other, but one half of my family's Catholic. So I have like 30 cousins or so. Everybody bred a lot. And again, those are your peers when you're very young and growing up, if you live in those kind of environments. Nowadays, like it's like, well, what do you do with your kids? You arrange play dates or they go to daycare or something. And so siblings may be playing a little bit different role, but historically they were a lot of our sort of social learning integration stuff.
Yeah. And you've touched on it briefly, but how does the oldest versus youngest sibling think and see the world differently to each other?
I think firstborns in general, like they put more responsibility on themselves and they feel much more driven to achieve. That doesn't mean that laterborns can't achieve, because some of them are amazing. Charles Darwin was a laterborn laterborn child, and certainly made a big difference to biology and other fields. But I think, the way in which they're driven is sometimes different because of the parental expectations that are placed on them. And also, I think a lot of times firstborn children do a lot of supplementary childcare in many families historically, and I think some still do today. But where they're expected to take care of their younger sibling and they're expected to teach them things. And that's probably positive and negative, right? I mean, it's an extra responsibility for them, but it actually, I think, probably is a benefit to them for like in terms of their own thinking about things, right? Because they're teaching others. So it helps your own understanding. And I think there's, I mean, it's not a big difference, but there's some IQ data showing that like, firstborns tend to have an higher IQ, but it's like one IQ point. So it's not like it makes a lot of difference in the real world, but it isn't like a consistent kind of effect. And it could be because of things like kind of teaching them, because it's hard to imagine that there would be any genetic thing that would influence. And parents could spend more time with the first child doing a lot of that early teaching. So I think, in general, they tend to see the world more like their parents do, unless they've had a lot of conflict because they don't fulfill parental expectations. But in the ones where they fulfilled them, they tend to be upholders of the status quo. The babies of the family, they're more likely to be the rebels of the family.
Yeah.
Not so much interested in the status quo. And that's true whether they're the last or they're just later born. Like in these big, large families, you see the effects for a lot of the later born children. Frank Sulaway wrote a book years ago about later born children called Born to Rebel. That's an inherent part. And if you look at like who were the revolutionaries over our history, right? Politically, scientifically, a lot of them have been later born children. Many successful scientists and politicians have been firstborns, but the ones who rock the boat tend to be the later born ones. But it's because they're not placed in a position. They have to sort of, work harder to get their position, or they have to think outside the box to get their position. So it's going to make them more likely to entertain things that may end up changing the way we view the world. So more of an outside the box thinker, I think.
Yeah. And what are some behavioral differences of only children?
I haven't spent a lot of time studying only children because I think they're a little bit problematic in terms of the variables that I'm interested in, which include things like birth spacing and number of siblings. In most studies, or at least some studies anyways, they look a lot like firstborns without any of the effects of sibling competition, right? So all of the parental pressure is on them, and for better or for worse, right? And none of the negotiating stuff happens for them. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't sometimes learn those skills, because they do have peers, right? Parents often make an effort, if they have only children, to make sure they have playmates, and that they interact with children, whether it be daycare or school, that they get those experiences, because we know that matters. But in general, they are more likely to be the one egg in the basket. And we know that's not always the best kind of way to raise children. I mean, It does, I think, cause more anxiety, right, in the children because they to perform in certain ways. And we've seen how that kind of pressure in some other cultures can be detrimental to children and to their mental health. So, I mean, from a grand perspective, the fact that we have a lot more one-children families is maybe not ideal. But I mean, there definitely are ways that you can compensate by being aware to not put all those pressures on your children, but also to facilitate them getting better and strong peer relationships, right? So that they start getting good at all of those social skills that you want them to have, but that they don't just automatically get in the home because they have siblings interacting with them or playing with them. I always used to tell a story about how I was a late walker in my family. My brother walked quite young, but he was the firstborn. I walked quite a bit later. And part of the reason I walked later, there were two reasons. One is that my brother would do stuff for me. That's stuff I didn't have to do it. But the other, parents sometimes just do things because they're fashionable, right? And when I was little, it was fashionable to have these like little chair things for kids to sit in that had wheels on them. And so they,
yeah.
yeah, but then you don't get strong enough legs to hold yourself up. And so even when I started walking, if I didn't have anything to hang on, I would just fall out because I had like spaghetti legs. And so, I think it's great to give parents advice on things that can be helpful. But I think we also always need to be cautious about what we give because we don't want to always suggest things that could turn out to be maybe not that helpful. I do think, again, always, at least in terms of only children, to not put all your hopes and dreams on that child. That's a lot to do.
Definitely. Yeah, I love pressure. And why do parents and kids clash about dating? What's really going on under the surface in that?
Well, I think there can be different things depending on the situation, but I think one of the things that's a clash with dating is, and I think it's been described well by some people, I think Buss and Menelaus have also done some studies that look at parent-offspring conflict over mating. That you might think that parents and children would agree on what a good partner for their child would be, but they don't always because there's other things involved, right? So when you're young, you might prioritize, especially before you have kids, you might prioritize attractiveness more than you might prioritize earning potential. In that early dating phase, where parents might prioritize that earning potential or good social connections, for example. Things that could benefit the whole family versus just benefiting you. And I think we often don't think about this because we're thinking about modern mating decisions in Western cultures where you make your mating choices, right? You decide who you're going to marry. But a lot of human history, parents probably did have a lot bigger say in who you married. Think about cultures with arranged marriages. But historically, that may have been a much more common sort of pattern to see in a lot of different cultures. And so in those, there might have been actually a lot more conflict over, okay, you would like this, but this is what the parents are going to make the decision and they're going to enforce it. But I think a lot of times sometimes it's the prioritization of what some people might call good genes versus resource potential. Some of it is parent-offspring conflict over, especially for daughters, over engaging in short-term mating versus long-term mating, where parents would prefer that the daughter pick somebody and settle down and not be doing too much short-term mating because there's a concern about whether too much short-term mating impairs her ability to get a quality long-term mate, right? The idea that if she's had a lot of sexual partners, that might not be seen as being as desirable. It may also be that parents just are perceiving behavior and reputation differently than the children. But all of those things, I think, can have a big impact on conflict between parents and children about dating and how much people may be comfortable or not with bringing home partners to meet parents, right? And maybe you don't care that much if it's a short-term thing or you're not thinking about long-term, but once you start thinking about long-term, you think a lot more about image management. making sure parents are on board because, you know, they're going to be grandparents one day, perhaps, and you want them to be involved in investing in grandchildren and things like that as well. And you want harmonious family get-togethers and stuff. So that, I think it matters more as you move into the longer term mating versus the shorter term dating. Although I suspect there are a lot of boys who are interested in short term mating and bring home short term girlfriends that drives their parents crazy. Or at least the mother's crazy and the dad's maybe, yeah, I'd tap that too. I mean, they're going to be, oh yeah, I would have done that too. And the mother's like, oh,
Yeah, yeah. Well, that shows the two different, I guess, mating strategies, short term versus long term. But yeah, good PR, I guess, is important if it's a long term relationship.
yep, probably across the board to your family and your friends, right? Because,
Yeah,
again, social relationships matter and having social allies matter. And it's a lot easier when your girlfriend or your guy friends also like the partner that you picked as well.
definitely. And why do so many young girls or young women struggle with eating, and why is there such a high prevalence of eating disorders among especially teenage girls?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of hypotheses. I've certainly done a fair bit of work on this from when I was in grad school to just publishing something a year or so ago. I think I think that there may be mechanisms that are ancestral that are behind it, and the reason it is so problematic in the modern environment is because of the mismatch between what the ancestral environment was like in the modern environment. So most of the theories about sort of adaptationist theories looking at eating disorders focus on they all focus in a sense on competition between women. And where they differ is how much attention they pay to competition over mates versus competition over status, right? But it's all competition in that sense. And back when I was I was a postgraduate, I developed with my colleagues at Simon Fraser University a female competition stress test. So it was looking at how much female competition over status or over mating or male attention was causing stress in individuals. And then we were looking at what that relationship was compared to eating disorders, right? So whether people actually had disordered attitudes or actual eating disorders. And indeed, it does appear that both of those kinds of stresses are related to disordered attitudes towards eating, and in some cases, actual behavior that is unhealthy in terms of eating. And why I think it's so much a problem in the modern environment. So in an ancestral environment, there's sort of two ways this could have worked. One is that it could have been that it's useful to suppress eating a little bit, to drop your weight a little bit, when little differences in body composition can make you fertile or infertile, right? And in subsistence populations, you can see how easily that would happen. In an overweight American population, you need a much bigger difference to drive that. But if you've got relatively low body fat, dropping just a little bit is likely to suppress it. And maybe if it's bad conditions for breeding because there's a lot of competition in your environment, maybe it's better to just lose a little bit of weight, not to lose a crazy amount, but just a little bit, and then not be reproducing. The other sort of, and that's what we call the reproductive suppression model. The other model is the sexual competition model. And it's a model that's basically arguing that if you're in an environment for females where there's a lot of competition for mates, you want to look young and you want to look beautiful, and you need to have lower weight to look young and beautiful. And that might be particularly problematic, again, in an environment where people tend to be overweight as opposed to underweight. But both of them really are saying the problem is female competition, okay? And the larger your competitive environment, the more problematic this is going to be. And in the ancestral environment, if you lived in a village, a few hundred people, there's your competitors. And nowadays, if you go to a high school where there's 3,000 students, you can see that there's going to be a problem because you have a much bigger competitive pool of females. And there's going to be a lot more pressure to compete to be high status or to compete for the attentions of guys in that environment. And one might even imagine that could be even more problematic on university campuses these days, because we have a lot less men on university campuses these days, and then a lot more competition on the part of women for those few guys that are available. So I think part of the reason that this could get exacerbated to the level that we're talking about, because again, when we're talking about eating disorders, nobody's just dropping a few pounds to look younger, or dropping a few pounds to be just below, fertility level, right? We're talking about really dramatic, unhealthy changes in people's eating behavior on their physical situation. But that may be because the cues that are triggering this are staying on for a long time, because you're in big schools, you're getting exposed to all these social media images, all these people on TV and in film that you're perceiving as competition. It's the same thing really as looking at, okay, how many images of people are you exposed to? And do you think women in your own community are less attractive because you're exposed only to beautiful ones? It's the same thing working on women to convince them that their environments are really highly competitive, and then them engaging in this behavior that then is actually not serving their best interests because it's actually having a negative physical effect.
I went to a all boys school from 11 until 16. And then in sixth form, so for the last 2 years before university, I went to an all girls school because the sixth form was mixed. So I always think I was in some sort of put myself in 2 social experiments, right? And yeah, what you're describing, where it's like a lot of girls and then like the university campuses and then like a few boys. This was even more extreme because this was like 10 boys versus like a few hundred girls. And yeah, I remember there being a lot of problems with body dysmorphia and image, like kind of eating disorders and stuff as well. Is it probably because of that high competition and low access?
Yeah, I think that's the case, that again, you can have these mismatches that influence people's behavior and strategies, right? And one reason you may have so much of a hookup culture on campuses is there are so few males and lots of females. The male strategy is going to be the one that gets followed. If you want any sex, it's going to be what the guys want. And if what they want is short term, then yeah, you'll see more hookups. And they may or may not leave women feeling happy about the situation. But it's just the skewing the sex ratio tends to create like a market, imbalance in that way. And definitely I could see how that could happen if you were in a school situation where that kind of stuff switches and all of a sudden there's like this real privileged position, right, for a particular group of people. And again, I mean, you could also imagine that situations where males are experiencing high levels of competition can drive male behavior, right? If men are being as competitive over status and dominance and attracting women, all of a sudden guys may be spending an awful lot of time in the gym, right? Trying to make themselves larger and more dominant and, look like better protectors, right? Um, and I think that is probably the more common output of high levels of male competition for men, rather than just dietary restriction and becoming very skinny. They're more likely they may control their eating, but it's going to be, I'm just going to eat protein and work out at the gym, that then skews it in that kind of direction for them, which again can have negative health consequences if it's taken to the extreme.
Yeah. So you saying me eating 1 kilogram worth of chicken wings is because of mating strategies and trying to increase my...
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the gym, going back to what I said about being at the girls' school, I was really skinny when I was there, and my hair was like almost your length, right? And then as soon as I left that environment, I then started going to the gym, and then now my hair's shorter. I feel more confident, a bit more assertive and stuff. Is that just changing and adapting?
I mean, I think to a certain extent. I mean, I think that in general, for men, when men work out and they're building muscle, that's going to increase their self-confidence and their feeling that they're more sort of capable and stronger and things like that. But it also can affect testosterone levels. And in general, men, when their testosterone is a little bit higher, tend to feel a little bit more assertive and things like that. And so I think and obviously puberty changes that for boys as well, right? So, I mean, very young boys, there's, that's not having a really big effect. But as they get older and they're going through these changes and they may start working out, I think a lot of those things are to be expected at that point in their lives. I think also some of that, the confidence and the self-esteem also comes from other people's reactions to you. And so as other people appreciate what you're doing, in terms of building your, body and whatever, or whatever you're doing with your appearance, that when you get positive reinforcement for that, that tends to make you feel better, right? Because self-esteem in many ways is a reflection of how other people esteem you.
Yeah.
And so, for men, many of those signals of masculinity, right, we're going to get them approval from other people, right? That's going to make them feel more confident in the first place. So they kind of get into a feedback loop with that.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely. It's just interesting how what the female, all kind of female version of that is to suppress your eating, which can be very dangerous for your health if it's taken to extreme right. And then the male one is putting on a bit more muscle, which often is a net positive. Obviously, it can be taken too far and you can go on to steroids and stuff, but is the prevalence of that scenario versus females having extreme eating disorders, what's the ratio of that? Because I feel like a lot of the time, most guys don't take it too far with the muscles, whereas maybe the eating disorders end up being more dangerous.
Yeah, the eating disorders can end up being more dangerous. I do think that the number of women who have clinically significant non-responsive eating disorders who die as a result of them are also relatively low. That there's a lot more sort of what I would call subclinical diet.
Sorry, bottle fell over.
Other kinds of things that are not as significant. And I also think there's probably a difference between having such high levels of competition that women engage in disordered eating to that level, and also the difference between women just wanting to look attractive for men. Because in general, men don't find like anorexically thin women sexually attractive because they like curvy, like figures, like, like porn star is an exaggeration, but like that, type of figure, having a small waist and bigger hips. And that disappears when women have eating disorders. And so I think for women, and this may be true for men too. Some men will actually bodybuild to the point that it's not as attractive for women, or exaggerated, right? Versus, like a nice competitive swimmer's build or something. That again, there's extremes that can be associated with it that are more problematic. And that, again, there is a sweet spot.
Again,
What is attractive, like the Chris Evans kind of body, Captain America, right? That's often considered an ideal of what women would find sexually attractive. He's not The Rock, he's not a huge dude, but he's got a very physically, strong build. And for women, it's not necessarily, it's not like a waist thin runway model or Dolly Parton necessarily, but it's something in between, it's, somebody who's got a curvaceous figure, but that is not particularly thin or particularly overweight. And again, weight is probably one of the least relevant things to attractiveness. The shape is what really seems to be a huge part of it. But it's, it again, youth, fertility, these are things that you can index by the shape of women's bodies. And for men, strength and physical athleticness is very clearly depicted in the shape of men's bodies as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting how it's taken to the extreme and the bell curve in the middle is normally the best. But is it the way we've evolved, the reason why it's taken to the extremes, or is it the environment and the competition?
Yeah, and I think it's the environment is why we see the extremes, right? I mean, even when you think about it in terms of like the weight, right? Like, okay, the dieting is an extreme that's caused by the modern environment, but so is the obesity, because you couldn't get like that in the ancestral environment, right? There just wasn't the ability to do that. You had to work to get your food. and, we don't work together in the same way now. And so, the range of normal or the range of what is ideal is, much narrower than the range of what we can get in the modern.
Definitely. And if there's one idea or study or fact that you've found from your research and your work that you want the audience to take away, what would it be?
Well, I don't know if there's one thing. I mean, I think one useful thing to think about is that, there is a sort of sense of universal human nature, but that doesn't mean universal human behavior,
Yeah.
right? That our nature interacts always with our environment and the context, and that's what produces behavior. And so behavior is in some ways, a lot more complicated, and yet in other ways more simple, right? We see the behavior, but um, the sort of the calculus, whatever, but the way that the behavior is developed and manifested in terms of its interaction with human nature and the environment is more complicated. And I don't know. I mean, to me, that's something that I always like to keep in mind, and something I always talk about with my students. The other thing, and this is not related to my research results at all, but I do think it's really important for people to keep in mind when we say we're studying human behavior and we're taking an evolutionary perspective, is that when we say that a behavior evolved, we're not saying that behavior is a good behavior or a bad behavior.
Yeah.
We're just saying that it exists and it was shaped by the environment in which we evolved it. And so, it's like if you talk about examples of things like murder, you talk about homicide, you talk about sexual assault, you talk about any of those kinds of behaviors. If I'm interested in parental investment or sibling conflict or cooperation, some siblings will give a kidney to save their sibling's life. And some of them might kill their sibling, right? Understanding the factors and the mechanism that shapes that behavior is very important and very useful, but that doesn't condone any particular outcome of the mechanism, right? And I think that's really important to understand, because you'll often see people say, well, you're saying this is a good thing. Not good or bad. It's just is. And if we think it's bad and you want to change it, you better understand the mechanism that shaped it.
Yeah, it's trying to find an explanation rather than a justification. And if these mechanisms and behaviors exist, why would we try and turn the other cheek and look the other way? We should try and figure out why they're happening.
Right. Especially if you would want to change anything or improve anything, because you can't do it if you don't understand why it's the way it is.
Exactly. And if you could give your 20-year-old self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh God. That's a tough question. Either way, it's just, well, you know what? Like, if I was just doing it all over again, get married and have kids. Not a lot of kids. I'm like totally in favor of the like one of each kind of thing.
Yeah.
I might actually say that, like, even though that's not what I did. But I think I might say that now, because I think that, as you get older, you think about what you're going to leave behind. And if you're going to leave behind a pile of research papers, kids, one of those somehow seems more important. Maybe I feel differently if I cured cancer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I haven't. I think that, there's a value in that legacy to me that I think is something that I did think about when I was 20.
Good advice. Good advice, especially with the birth rates that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah, but also with the right partner.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Careful about partner choice part. That's also important.
Yeah. You wouldn't want to have kids with a psychopath, but you'd probably rather not have any kids.
Yeah, well, or just avoid the psychopaths. Yeah, would be good advice.
Yeah, I asked Todd Shackelford a few days ago what what's the possible evolutionary explanation or reason for their psychopaths surviving in the gene pool and just existing throughout human history and recurring throughout human history. What's your take on that?
It's probably not that different from Todd's, actually. I think that it's a cheating strategy, right? So if we think about the world being generally full of people who lived in small groups, who are cooperators, there is a role for cheaters when you don't live in those small groups, right? Or when you can move easily between groups. And I actually think that there's probably always been a very low frequency of psychopaths in the population. I think there could be more now because I think that strategy can be more successful in large urban mobile environments where you can go and fuck up a town and screw up people's lives, and then you can move on to the next one. Even social media doesn't necessarily always follow you that well, although maybe one day it will actually catch all of those people. But I think that if your strategy is to be a non-cooperator, the modern world is one that strategy can be more successful in. And I think there's some evidence out there that psychopaths are often, at least male ones, are a bit more attractive. They may be very charismatic, so they may not have problems getting mating opportunities. And if they have a lot of short-term mating, they could actually out-reproduce other males, but only if there's not very many of them in the population, because if everybody's a psychopath, then the population just increases. So it's got to be a low frequency strategy no matter what. But I think the modern environment could be more friendly to them.
Yeah, it's not an evolutionary stable strategy if there were loads of them. It's a minority that get it.
Or if you're in a really small population where ostracization from the population is going to mean death, right? You have to be able to move to a different population because you can't just take advantage of your own, unless you're the only doctor in the community or the only good hunter or something that would make you valuable despite that. But in general, it's not going to be a strategy that works in small face-to-face societies.
Yeah. I said to Todd, I remember reading a possible explanation for why they could be beneficial to small communities or small tribes. And if you were fighting a rival tribe, you kind of would want a psychopath to just go in and murder everyone in that specific scenario.
Yeah, if they were like the perfect sniper or the perfect warrior, then there'd be an advantage to having them on your side for sure. I mean, that is one of the trade-offs of highly aggressive and perhaps somewhat psychopathic men is that during warfare, but during peacetime, they're a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is probably why there's a small percentage, because a lot of the time it is peaceful. And what is the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath? I've never been able to wrap my head around
I'm not entirely sure I've ever really grasped it. I think that part of the difference has come out of the fields in which people study, so that you see more psychologists call them psychopaths and more people who've come out of criminal behavior and sociology call them sociopaths. To me, I don't know that there's a valuable takeaway difference. To me, when I was a student, I came to understanding it through like Robert Hare's work on them and the psychopathy checklist, and people were doing research on them in prison populations and stuff like that. And thought about it that way. And when I teach criminal behavior, that's kind of the approach that I take. Students are always interested, even though you tell them these are not the largest number of criminals out there. Most criminal behavior is not committed by psychopaths. They're still really interested in that. And they're also interested, well, or at least I think sometimes in class, they were interested in the difference between people who would be psychopathic to the level that they commit criminal acts of violence and those who might just take advantage of other people.
Yeah.
Right? Is there a degree of psychopathy where this shifts it, or is there, are there psychopaths who can be just, evil CEOs or something and never actually, commit violence against others? They're just overly self-interested or something like that, which I think is also kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is part of your expertise, but you might know the definition of it. But what's Machiavellianism? I've read The Prince by Machiavelli recently, and what's that?
So when they talk about psychopathy, or they talk about that sort of the dark triad, right? It's psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and
Is it narcissism?
narcissism, I think.
Yeah.
Some other terms of that. Anyways, the Machiavellianism is really very much a sort of instrumental approach to other individuals, right? Like it's the idea that people are a means to an end. Now, again, there are lots of people who engage in some level of that, like on a everyday basis, right? Because I mean, to some people in your life are a means to an end, right? They may not be somebody that you care about a lot, but there's somebody that maybe you work with or whatever. When you only see people as a means to an end, right, then it makes it really easy to not be empathetic towards them, right? And that lack of empathy is something that also characterizes people who are considered to be psychopathic, that they don't care about other people in the way that many people would care about other individuals or other individuals suffering. And then it makes it easier to do things that cause other people to suffer.
Yeah. So interesting. We need to do a whole deep dive on that. Definitely the dark triad.
It's really an interesting, I don't know, really interesting topic, which I do not know nearly as much about as I would like to. But there's a bunch of people out there that have done really interesting work on dark triad stuff that would be worth chatting with on that topic, I guess.
Definitely. Well, you know more than me. Catherine Salmon, ladies and gentlemen. Catherine, really appreciate your time. Really appreciate your work. You've enlightened me on many different things about evolutionary psychology, and I hope the audience learned as much as I did today. It was really interesting. That middle child kind of thing. And just, I was saying it to Todd a few days ago again, just it's such a good mental model to have to explain behaviors or reasons for behaviors, evolutionary psychology. And it's something that more people probably should study.
Just it gives you more insight into your own behavior and other people's behavior too.
Yeah.
And in a way that you can try and just like depersonalize it and not think about baggage and stuff like just try to think about it in a sort of clearer way, I suppose, outside of that. But thanks for having me on. It's been fun to chat about all of this.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And what are you currently working on now?
Always many things that are bizarre. So let's see. I mentioned before, I am actually working on male competition stress. And we had collected data on a college sample, and we're collecting data on a community sample to go along with that. I'm working on a new measure looking at mate value, trying to develop a different measure than what people are currently working on in that area. I just finished a study that's under review with Jimmy Moran that is on analingus. So doing some unusual sexual or at least atypical sexual behavior in some sense, and also looking at some health related stuff with that. Stuff like that. Yeah,
well, I'd love to have you back on to discuss all of those things. Wait, so did you say anal? What's the evolutionary reasons for doing anal sex?
It's not really actually even targeted so much on what's the evolutionary reason for doing it, although there is some on evolutionary reasons why people might not do it, which mainly have to do with disease transmission. And so people who are more disgust sensitive tend to be less likely to engage in that kind of behavior or engage in those sexual activities. But yeah, I had done a study looking at what behaviors people found degrading in terms of sexual behaviors. And that was a behavior that people included as mildly degrading, but also reported doing. So on here. So, we did another study that actually there was several different studies of different populations asking different kinds of questions about who does it. Do you do it because you like it or because your partner likes it? A bunch of different stuff. And then we asked about things like disease, discuss sensitivity and, sexual desire, a bunch of different things to try and untangle some of what's going on with that. But yeah, I started doing a few studies on pornography, and then it just sent me down a rabbit hole of sexual behavior studies. So
yeah, sounds fascinating. And where can people? Yeah, I can imagine. And where can people go if they want to find your work?
My stuff. Well, there's I guess a couple places. I mean, the main places, if they're interested in getting in touch with me, they can always get in touch with me at my email, which is Catherine_Salmon@redlands.edu. But they can go to the University of Redlands website and type my name in, and it'll bring up my faculty profile page, which has some information about the research I've been doing and also ways to get in touch with me. I have a few podcasts, I think, on YouTube, but those are kind of the easiest ways to.
Awesome. Well, I'll leave a link to all the stuff in the show notes so people can check out your work. And yeah, thank you so much, Catherine, and
Thanks.
hopefully speak to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
If you want to start your own podcast but have no idea where to start, and you want to generate viral social media clips and get your dream guests onto your show, even from just using your laptop in your bedroom like I did, then my Pro Remote Podcast Blueprint is exactly for you. It is a private paid course and community that has every single step and process I've used and continue to use to grow this show. And I include every single secret, every single tactic I do and still use that will get you results super fast. And also, if you want to access me personally every single week, then as part of this course, you'll also be able to join live weekly calls where I go through your podcast and answer your questions to get you results much, much faster. So if you want to actually start a podcast and stop dreaming and get millions of social media views and book your dream guests in half the amount of time it took me, then click the first link in the description.